ergens in Colorado, in een Indiaans reservaat, woont Marc Andrew Donski. Hij is biochemist en hij specialiseert zich in mushroom cultivation. Dat wil zeggen het kweken van paddenstoelen. In eerste instantie was hij gefascineerd door de psychedelische kwaliteiten daarvan, maar steeds meer kijkt hij naar zaken als medische toepassingen van mushrooms. Marianne Krediet had een interview met hem in zijn huis.
Here at Marc Donski's place, and we're going to talk about mushrooms. Marc, what are mushrooms meaning? What's mushrooms meaning to you?
Well, I think what's more important is what mushrooms mean to the world, and they keep us from piling up in detritus of everything that's dead. I mean, they decompose everything and bring everything back into the recycle of life. And so for me, they're a metaphor for my putting back into the world and working with the world.
I see. So how did you...
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And how did you, and when did you get involved into mushrooms and growing them, eating them? And...
Well, after high school, I started learning how to identify mushrooms just because from walking around the woods in Colorado, there's just such a bizarre and interesting life form that you want to know what they are. Mm-hmm. And so we started learning how to identify them. And then plus my mother's French, so I grew up having mushroom omelets and, you know, mushrooms in my dishes. And so once I did that, after learning to identify them, I mean, those were the first common ones, just learning how to identify and observing them and eating them. Uh-huh. And then in the late 70s, I guess it was, or the early 70s,
yeah,
I started reading a lot of John Cunningham Lilly's work, who did research with LSD and with dolphins for the Navy. And he did these experiments in what he called sense deprivation tanks. Yeah. And they were float tanks where the body, he was floating in an isotonic solution that was body temperature in a light-proof, soundproof room. And so basically he isolated his mind and he would do these experiments with LSD. He was the last person to have a grant doing experiments with LSD in the country. And he went through these, he mapped out these different states of consciousness, you know, from normal state of consciousness to so-called samhati, or what he called samhati or nirvana. Mm-hmm. But when he came out of his experiments, he was very skeptical of his experiences because, he, of course, he'd done all this reading, and so he felt very pre-programmed that he was maybe possibly just projecting what he had read into his environment.
Right.
And so I felt that I was always, you know, if these states have any basis in physical reality, these so-called higher states of consciousness, you should be able to get feedback from the world around you when you're in these states of consciousness. So I wanted to repeat his experiments, so to, in a sense, only instead of doing it in a sense deprivation environment, doing it in a sensory overload environment, basically where you have the whole world filling your senses, and tried to see if I could attain or experience these states as described, and if I could get feedback from the world around me. So I went to Mexico and I collected some mushrooms, and I began cultivating mushrooms. These are the psychedelic mushrooms. I began cultivating mushrooms, and then when I was an undergraduate at Tucson, I'd go out to the desert at Oregon Cactus National Monument.
Oh, that's
which is where Don Juan supposedly met Castaneda, or in the stories Castaneda met Don Juan.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And it's a very magical place. It's just very magical. The Sonoran Desert is, well, desert I heard once described as desert is God without man.
Oh, that's
beautiful. And desert is just very powerful. And I had this one hill that I would go to each time, and I would sit on this hill and I would do what I now recognize to be overdoses of mushrooms. And see, and
so what did you experience? Did you experience
in a word samhati? In a word samhati.
Yeah? Okay.
I mean, the states of consciousness just became so apparent. I mean, you're in this. The beauty. The world suddenly became real.
So was it your mind, or was it the reality that changed.
And that was that's always a question when you're in
Yeah.
when you're in a psychedelic experience. Are you projecting? Are you just thinking? Are you making stuff up? And that was the whole basis of doing them out in the desert is, could I get any feedback from the world around me that could validate these experiences? And first of all, I have to say that the experiences were just so filled with beauty, and I have to say I feel that they were very religious experiences, and
Yeah.
the basis of it was that religion is just beauty and breath, and so
no suffering.
there's no suffering. You don't. I mean, the light. There's just so much beauty, and life is just so filled with light. I mean, I hate that word's been used over and over and over, but it is. It's just brilliant, just brilliant and beautiful, and each breath was just ecstatic. And then once I had reached that realization, or once I had that feeling, all of a sudden things started. I got a transition that it wasn't just something that was coming into me, but it was something that I was a part of, and there was no separating myself from the world and from the beauty, and that each breath I took was the breath of the world and breath of the universe and da-da-da-da-da, right? So then I started realizing my acupuncture points, my meridians became very obvious to me. I did a simple test. I mean, this is supposed to be an experiment, so I would bring myself back into my intellect and say, okay, well, what kind of experiment could you do to get validation? And you go, well, think of a hawk. And so a hawk would come into the environment.
So reality and mind became
more
one.
Right, exactly.
There became more obvious.
There was the physical basis to these states of reality, or to these states of consciousness, and reality is much more than we generally perceive it to be.
Yes, because you only see it outside of ourselves.
Exactly. We see ourselves as being separate from the world around us, rather than to being an integral part of the world around us. Where, as Gurdjieff, I think, puts it, he says, we're just basically different levels of crystallization of the atmosphere around this planet. And once you think of it that way, you see how much of an integral part of life and the planet and the whole world we are, and how important it is, how important everything we do actually can become and actually is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because you told me also that the insights you got, as I may call them insights, were based in reality, because you started studying in Berkeley, and that's where you found out that your insights were actually taught there.
Yeah, after I had these experiences with mapping out my meridians, my acupuncture points.
That came as an intrinsic experience?
As an experience, as a observation. I would just call it observation. I would just look at myself and I would just see, whoa, what's going on here? And I just went down and just hit all the points. And so when after my undergraduate school, I went to do my graduate work in Berkeley. Before I even found a place to live, I got there about a month before graduate school started, or the semester started. Before I even had a place to live, I signed up for an acupressure at the Acupressure Institute to see what my experiences and my knowledge of the meridians and the points was, how it corresponded to what had been taught formally over thousands of years. And they never showed me a point or a breathing technique that mushrooms hadn't shown me. But I think an important thing is we've been emphasizing and talking a lot about how this is a mushroom-induced experience and stuff like that. And I think what's important was that the mushrooms opened a window. There's one point in these experiences in the desert where mushrooms took me to this window. I mean, I literally saw it as a window. I mean, I saw the whole world around me, but there's kind of a window around the intensity and the degree of energy that I was able to perceive. And they said, look through this window.
Yeah.
And I could look through the window. They said, we could take you to this window and open and you could look through it from here.
Yeah.
But you have to go the rest of the way yourself. And
what do you mean by going the rest of the way yourself? Without the mushrooms?
Without mushrooms. They said, what I felt was being told to me was that, okay, you've been given this vision, you've been given this insight, you've been given this. I mean, there's so much energy in the universe. If you could just touch just an iota of it, you would just have the energy to do anything anything you want. You could move mountains, basically, right? I mean, it's really true that the mustard seed of faith can move a mountain.
Yeah.
And the mustard seed of faith is pretty easy to come by, but what they forget to tell you is that a virus particle of doubt will prevent you from doing that, right? And they basically said, look, here's all the opportunity, all the education, everything, your parents, your forefathers, have brought you to this point. You've been given this training and opportunity, and you have work to do. You have a positive outlook, and you have to put it into the world, and you have to work, and you have to add to the world, and you have to be productive. And it's just that will bring you to the point. You don't, it's not a matter of getting to this ecstatic state. Getting to the ecstatic state is not the purpose of life, basically.
So what you're saying is that you should not only have it in a sort of other dimension, but bring it down here and work with these insights. And
exactly.
Is that how you would phrase it? Or?
Yeah, that's exactly how I'd phrase it. And also that I would even phrase it, maybe this is because of my academic training, that it was a lesson that I was learning. I was in a classroom, I had taken the class, you go on to the next class, you learn the lesson. You don't keep repeating the same class over and over and over. You don't just take mushrooms over and over again to get to the same ecstatic state. You move forward with your life, and you add to what you've done and how you're connected to the world and what part of the world you've manifested benevolency or for me, I always like the analogy of plants. I mean, for me, plants became the most important thing. They provide the oxygen we breathe. They provide the food that we eat. Whether you're vegetarian or whether you're carnivore, plants are at the basis of of life, basically, on this planet.
Yeah. And
so I always felt, well, I want to be a farmer, of some sort. I want to grow food. I want to work, in the environment. And when you talk about the depletion of the soils and things like that, mushroom growing just seemed to be very real for me. And my experiences with mushrooms led me towards mushroom.
What is a mushroom different from other plants for you?
Okay, there was a time when all life on the planet was classified by scientists as either plant life or animal life.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and then later on they started dividing, those were called the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. And then they divided the plant kingdom into the bacteria kingdom, the protist kingdom, which is all the single-celled little organisms, and the fungal kingdom, and then the higher plants, the flowering plants.
Mm-hmm.
And so they put the fungus in their own kingdom, and they really do belong there. It's been reported that the major biomass on the planet is mycelium, which is the underground part of a mushroom or a fungus. There's different levels of fungus. Mushrooms are what are called the higher fungi, right? Versus the lower fungi, which would be like penicillin, bread molds, things like that. And so, once again, mushrooms and fungus are for the most part, especially the higher mushrooms, are involved in recycling dead material into living material.
But what you just said, the lower mushrooms are also providers of medicine.
Right, and exactly. And
that's why you're into it also, I have understood.
And it's very, and what's interesting is that Western medicine, even though after it discovered penicillin and all these antibiotics from lower fungus, they didn't start to investigate the higher fungus for medicinal properties.
Uh-huh.
And it's only recently that the higher fungus have been investigated for medicinal properties, even though the Chinese have used like reishi mushrooms for thousands of years as an adaptogenic herb and as adaptogenic herb. It just basically strengthens the body's response to stress, so stress doesn't affect it so dramatically.
I see,
so you could stand stressors. The Sherpas have been using reishi mushrooms for a long time as a high altitude, for high altitude sickness and to function at high altitudes.
Uh-huh.
It's been recently shown that there's these compounds that are called polysaccharides, which are similar to carbohydrates, similar to starches, but they have just different branches and different linkages, and that these compounds stimulate the immune system. And one of these compounds is responsible for 25% of the prescriptions in Japan for anti-cancer.
Really?
Yeah, and shiitake, maitake, and reishi are the three, most commonly used mushrooms. But there's a number of other used mushrooms. There's one book from this Japanese mushroom company that was given to me by a friend, and I mean almost every mushroom is in there.
And every mushroom you can use for medical use.
Can be used medicinally.
you elaborate a little bit more about the medicinal use of mushrooms? Because you have some mushrooms here, and tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, well, what we were saying before we changed our tape was that a lot of the biochemistry of mushrooms and the plants that they break down create these what are called polysaccharides, and those polysaccharides are of great benefit to just general health. They're immunostimulatory, they're anti-cancer, they're antiviral.
HIV maybe?
Yes. There's a number of studies that have been done with the maitake and the reishi mushrooms that show some inhibitory properties with HIV. Maitake especially. The mushrooms we have here are Ganoderma. This is Ganoderma lucidum, which is the reishi mushroom, which is the tea that we're drinking.
Right?
A
little bitter, but
it's very bitter.
Very good.
Some people find it too bitter, but there's other ways you add honey. You can combine it with ginseng, etc. Right?
Yeah.
It's been used for thousands of years by the Sherpas for high altitude sickness. It has allegedly anti-aging properties.
I was going to say, yeah.
Which come from its free radical scavenger properties, right? It's the free radical. There's compounds in it that are free radical scavengers. This grows in parts of America. This is one of the mushrooms we want to cultivate.
Wood-like.
It's very woody. And then if you look at it, I don't know if they could see it here, but there's pores. You can see them better on this one. Where you see those are little pores. Here you see the tubes.
So maybe just hold it up a little bit.
Right.
It's over here.
And there's tubes that run down.
Yeah.
And you could divide the higher fungus into a number of groups. Those with pores are one group. Those with tubes, or those with gills, right? The laminae that are underneath the common mushroom, you have gills, what are called gills underneath. And these are the pored mushrooms. This is Ganoderma appelantum. We found this in Denver, actually, in a park.
Really? Yeah.
And this is dried now. When we picked it, it was about this big around.
How did you dry it that it became so
It
woody almost?
I had it out here I had it out in my yard, basically, so the spores would spread over my property.
Okay.
So I just put it on a piece of wood where I hope the spores would drop into and possibly incubate, and then it just dried in the wind. And so this one was similar in size, so it was a very big mushroom too when it was fresh.
So actually, are you using these in your tea?
Yes, we use the dried mushroom.
You sort of sew them, or because it's hard to cut them, isn't it?
I haven't used this big one. You could just break them up, and you could powder them. You could make you could put them into capsules and take them that way. I think a lot of herbs places do recommend using whole herbs. I like to boil them, and I just take a whole mushroom and throw it into the pot and boil it, and then I drink the tea, and then I add more water, and I boil it again, and when I see that it's not extracting any more color, then I put it out into the environment, put it in the compost pile.
Yeah. And I heard you also say something about psychiatric use of mushrooms.
Okay, the psychiatric use of mushrooms, I mean, that's getting back to using the psychedelics and the psychotropic compounds. And there's been a lot of studies done as far as using psychedelic, mind-altering compounds or
Terence McKenna and those kind of people?
Claudia Naranjo is the one that comes to mind for me, who's a South American psychiatrist who wrote a book called The Healing Journey, where he goes through the different compounds that he has used clinically, and they're just very valuable for addictive behavior. That's their most valued use.
Against addictive behavior.
Against addictive behavior. Besides being able to eliminate the craving, they are actually able to eliminate physiological effects of
But don't
withdrawals.
you get a new craving, like for these mushrooms instead of?
Well, oftentimes there's a good thing about psychedelics is that they have a rapid threshold of what's the word I'm looking for? When you take a drug and then the next time you take it, it doesn't have an effect because you're used to it.
Right.
And so that's what happens with psychedelics. Well, with mushrooms or with psychedelics, it won't have any effect at all, and so you can't take it over and over and over again. Plus, the nature of the experience is such at an intensity that people don't want to take it the next day. When you're dealing with an addictive behavior, you have to have a guided trip. I mean, that's one thing that's very important. You have to have a person who's knowledgeable about the type of experience that a person may encounter and knows how to provide the set and setting, which is the terms that Dr. Andrew Weil uses for navigating or providing the environment in which the proper experience can take place.
I see.
And as well as it's important for re-establishing and reintegrating the experience into the normal world. And that's the one thing I think we didn't mention, is that oftentimes with the use of these psychedelics, people tend that they get into these ecstatic states and they think, well, this is it, you know, I've seen reality, I've been to nirvana, and this is where I want to be, and they just keep going back and back and back again. We sort of mentioned that when we say, well, you don't take the same class over and over and over.
Yeah, and there's no integration of
people
the deeper lesson.
Yeah, people actually do go crazy. They do harmful things to themselves because they haven't reintegrated the lessons, and they think that they need to go out of themselves to get to some state rather than using them as tools for a lesson to integrate a philosophy or a lifestyle into the world and
because their lives get more separated
in
in that way. The dimensional shifts that you experience, and then the normal life, and they get more and more apart.
They get more and more apart, and they're so ecstatic in the state they think, and they end up, you know, ignoring their health, ignoring their body, ignoring their responsibilities to their community, to their family.
Yeah,
it can be very disastrous. But so using any psychedelic medicinally takes a lot of control, and they're of great value.
I've heard like
can be used a lot, but
that
I think
you can skip years of treatment in psychiatric wards by using these mushrooms.
You could actually alleviate heroin addiction withdrawal symptoms, I believe, with a single experience where you come back and you've tweaked your biochemistry to the point where you don't crave the opiate and your body doesn't have the withdrawal symptoms.
So
you're free
why, I mean, since these mushrooms are so useful, why aren't they used more?
Well, I think because
so underestimated.
They're underestimated, but they are dangerous, and I don't think we have the doctors that have the experience that are able to you know do the controlled work, that are able to be the guides. And then, of course, I mean, we could get into the whole politics of attitudes towards psychedelics and towards drugs in general.
Yeah.
So,
but in Holland, that's a little different.
I guess it's a lot different.
Yes.
And so, I mean, I think there's probably much more work being done there that I'm totally unaware of.
Mm-hmm.
But so for me, being an American, and also just my parents are getting older, and I have friends that have cancer, and it just led me, I think the greatest value, well, a great value to medicinal mushrooms is their value in general health.
Yeah. And
that the polypores especially, all those mushrooms that just have pores, the whole family of them seem to have great beneficial value as far as immunostimulation. So that's where I want to concentrate on producing those.
So being a biochemist, you started on your own.
Right.
And that's what you're doing here. You're cultivating mushrooms and you're doing your own work on it.
We're in South Park, Colorado. I'm at 9,600 feet.
Yeah.
The nearest town is Como, Colorado. Mm-hmm. And there's a fellow there who's a wood carver, and he found this mammoth. It's the highest mammoth bones ever found as far as I'm aware of. And so we named our company Mammoth Mountain Mushrooms.
Right.
And we're dedicated to growing medicinal and as well as some gourmet mushrooms and producing medicinal mushrooms. And
so would you like to show me what you're doing? I mean, that would be a good idea. Okay, let's do that. So Marc, you're going to show us now the process of cultivating mushrooms.
Hi.
Yeah, what's
so
this?
We're going to spend the second part talking about cultivation and the techniques involved in cultivation. Now, there's basically two kinds of mushrooms that you can cultivate. There's the so-called copriphilous type mushroom that grows on compost or manure, composted manure. And there's the lignicolous mushrooms that grow on wood. Rishis, shiitakes are examples of lignicolous mushrooms. Psilocybes are examples of mushrooms that grow on compost or grow on manure. I understand that there's a lot of people interested in cultivating mushrooms in Holland, and so we're going to try to keep our talk general so they could get some idea of what they need to do if they want to start cultivating mushrooms. Okay, this is an autoclave or a pressure cooker. This is a key piece of equipment that you're going to need if you want to cultivate mushrooms. Basically, you have a vessel that you have a vessel inside a vessel. When you're growing mushrooms, there's 3 stages of mushroom growth. There's the so-called mycelial stage, which we see some examples of here. This is mycelium on grain. You might want to get a close-up of that if you can.
Yeah, that's powder? Or?
No, this is actually pressure-cooked rice. It's sterilized rice, which has been inoculated with mycelium.
Could you open it so we can see
this,
it?
It's a sterile culture. You can see how it's pure white. And this is the underground part of the mushroom that is now feeding off of the grain and has grown through the grain. Okay, now, with many mushrooms, this is as far as you have to go. You could just grow mushrooms on grain, and then you put a sterile casing, or you put a non-sterile layer called casing on the top, which is a layer of soil which changes the environment and allows the mushrooms to fruit, basically. You get the mushrooms, and you can actually fruit the mushrooms just out of jars on grain. Just a second. Okay, so this is one piece of equipment that you'll need for mushroom cultivation is a pressure cooker. And basically in the pressure cooker you'll take mason jars, which you'll fill with grain. That's why I misstepped over. That you fill with grain to a certain level, and then you'll add water. You put the jars in the cooker, and you cook them at 15 pounds of pressure for 45 minutes to 2 to 3 hours. 15 pounds is just over 1 kilogram of pressure. Okay. The other thing that you need, what's important in mushroom cultivation, because you're dealing with a fungus, you have to have what's called sterile technique, and you have to be able to work under sterile conditions. Otherwise, because you're dealing with such rich nutrient-laden substrates, you could get bread mold growing, you could get yogurt mold growing, there's any number of microorganisms that could grow on the substrate that you want your mushrooms to grow on. So you want to make sure that you have a pure culture. So to do that, you use sterile technique, and in my setup, what we have is a lab, our sterile room, which is our inoculating room, from where we isolate pure cultures from mushrooms, where we isolate our spore cultures, and where we do all our inoculation. So maybe we could show that.
Okay. Wait.
This is my inoculation room. It's a very simple room. We have what we call our inoculation box, which is just basically a box with armholes. We have 2 chambers. Okay. Nowadays, you can make what's called a laminar flow hood with an HEAV filter that filters the air and blows sterile air out. And you can just work in the open air on a table with a little box that is blowing sterile air out. I find this to be just as effective and just as easy. You see, the advantage of an HEAV filter is that you don't have to use a lot of strong chemicals to provide a sterile environment. In this chamber, I will wash it down with alcohol. If I've been trying to isolate a culture from a culture that is obviously contaminated, and after I'm done with that, I may actually wash it down with Clorox. Anyway, the inside of the box basically is sterile, is what we're trying to say. Here we have, inside the box, we have an alcohol lamp, and we have, an alcohol bath, or just a jar with some alcohol in it that we are able to dip our instruments into, and then using the alcohol lamp, we flame our instruments. These are Petri dishes. These are mushroom cultivation. So, the first stage in mushroom cultivation is you get a pure mycelial culture. For instance, here's a culture on on Petri dish of Pleuratus, the oyster mushroom. And
it's too much lighting.
okay. How's that? Can you see that?
Nope. Yeah, there it comes. Okay.
Basically, what we've done is I collected a mushroom in the wild, and I broke that mushroom open after cleaning the outside as well as I could, just dusting it off. I broke that mushroom open very carefully so I don't scatter dirt and stuff when I bust it open. And the very inside of that mushroom is sterile. Mm-hmm. And so I'm able to just cut out a very small piece of that mushroom, put it on a Petri dish, and that mushroom mycelium will then spread out. From here, I'm able to take this Petri dish and cut it into 4 pieces or 5 pieces, and take a piece of the Petri dish and put it in a jar of sterilized grain, and the mycelium will then grow on the grain. Mm-hmm. At this point, I could then case the grain, which is to say I open the jar up and I put 1 inch of soil on top of it, mm-hmm. and induce mushrooms to form. Or I could go into compost, or in the case of Pleuratus mushrooms, I will go into straw. Or in the case of shiitake mushrooms, I will go into wood chips, or actually into logs. There's another form. So this is called the spawn, when you have the mycelium growing through grain. This is grain spawn. There's another type of spawn which is called wood spawn, which is just the mycelium growing through sawdust or wood chips. Or you could actually grow mycelium on wood dowels. For instance, when we're growing shiitakes.
What are dowels?
Dowels are round pieces of wood.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
And by growing them on wood dowels, then you take these dowels and you drill holes in logs and you just pound these dowels into the logs and the mushrooms will grow out of the logs. So that's
what you basically do.
That's what I basically do.
And they get more and more. So what do you save them? You dry them?
The mushrooms that I'm growing are ones that we can dry, because there's always a problem with, fresh mushrooms are a pretty fragile vegetable, if you'll let me use that term.
Yeah.
And so where I am, there's a distribution problem as far as bringing fresh mushrooms to market all the time. I hope to do some farmers market, just because I think it's a wonderful thing to do, to offer fresh, organically grown mushrooms of many varieties at a farmer's market. But the medicinal mushrooms themselves can be dried, at which point they're very stable and they could be stored easily and they could be shipped.
Okay. Yeah?
Well, it's winter now, and so we're not doing a lot of compost making. This is the very end of the remnants of our last compost pile. That's the very basics of mushroom cultivation for the copriphyllous species. The lignicolous species are a little different, where we grow on sawdust or on wood. We've talked about that a little. There's a lot more to say, and I hope you could come back.
Wow. Thank you, Marc, for having me here. It's been a great experience.
Well, I want to really thank you for the opportunity to talk. It was really fun.
Well, maybe you should come over to Amsterdam and give us a lecture and a workshop on it.
I would love to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you.